Welcome to this lecture on ecosystem services, coastal and marine policy. My name is Miriam von Thenen and I'm a postdoc at the Leibniz-Institute for Baltic Sea Research in Warnemünde, Germany. In this lecture, I will shortly introduce you to coastal and marine policy, as well as marine ecosystem services, and explain why the ecosystem service concept is relevant for coastal and marine policy. Then I will show to what extent ecosystem services have been integrated into EU policy. And because there's one policy that requires to assess and map ecosystem services, I will highlight some of the challenges when it comes to assessing and mapping marine ecosystem services before providing an overview of the different marine ecosystem services. Then I will show some approaches that have been applied in the Baltic Sea. And finally, I will summarize the status of marine ecosystem service assessments, as well as drawing some conclusions with regard to integrating ecosystem services into EU policy. Why do we need coastal and marine policy? So the main reason is that marine ecosystems are under threat from different sources. So marine ecosystems are under threat from fishing as well as seafloor damage. Marine ecosystems are also affected by pollution through nutrient input from the land, which leads to eutrophication, for example, and also by contaminants from various sources. Invasive alien species also pose a threat to marine life, as do marine litter and underwater noise. And now the main aim of most of coastal and marine policies is to reduce or mitigate these pressures by restricting certain activities, putting regulation in place, and also by protecting certain species and habitats. And there's certainly a growing concern for marine ecosystems, for which the coastal and marine policy is being put in place, but also because we humans benefit or even depend on functioning marine ecosystems. What are some of these benefits? So, for example, we harvest food from the sea. We also harvest energy from the sea. Then there are certain structures, such as coral reefs, that reduce the wave energy and by that contribute to shoreline protection. And of course, the oceans are a very important carbon sink as well. Many people also just enjoy the rich marine wildlife, as well as the recreational space the oceans and coasts offer. And these we can divide into provisioning services, regulating services, and cultural services. And through these services, can we benefit from the oceans and seas. And this is the fundamental notion of the ecosystem service concept, that there are ecosystems, species, and processes in nature from which we all benefit and which contribute to our well-being without us sometimes even realizing it. And so ecosystem services present an additional reason or justification for protecting ecosystems and putting regulations and measures in place. And this is why this concept has also become important for coastal and marine policy. And there are indeed quite high expectations when it comes to integrating ecosystem services into policies. These include that it is expected that it can raise awareness of nature's contribution to society's socioeconomic well-being, as well as it is anticipated that it will encourage decision makers to prioritize solutions provided by nature, and it is expected that it can contribute or can provide long-term and holistic approaches. So in essence, the ecosystem service concept is expected to provide a holistic and systems perspectives on the complex interrelationships between nature and society, which is then expected also to promote sustainable use of natural resources. A study by Baumer et al. Analyzed in more detail to what extent ecosystem services have been incorporated into EU policy, and I adapted this figure to just show those policies that are relevant for coastal and marine areas. So, for example, you have the Habitat Directive and the Water Framework Directive, which contain some framing around ecosystem services, but the concept was hardly relevant for the policy measure design. Then the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, the Biodiversity Strategy, and the Invasive Alien Species Regulation have not only embedded the ecosystem services, but the concept was also relevant for developing the objectives and the policy measure design. So here you can see on this graph that it is a fast-growing field, these ecosystem services, shown with the publication output on this graph. And there's also an increase in incorporating this concept into policy. And now I have mentioned several of these policies already, so the different directives. And if you are not familiar with these directives, you may wonder what purpose they serve. So let's just have a brief look at the different directives. So the Habitat Directive aims at conserving habitats and species in the EU and lists important terrestrial as well as marine habitats that should be protected. The Water Framework Directive aims at achieving a good ecological status of rivers, lakes, groundwater, and bathing waters, including coastal waters. And the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is, in a way, the marine complement to this Water Framework Directive and aims at achieving a good environmental status in marine waters. Another directive which is important when it comes to the seas is the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which aims at allocating maritime activities to marine areas whilst ensuring the sustainable use of goods and services. The Invasive Alien Species Regulation wants to combat the further spread of these species, and the EU Biodiversity Strategy aims at halting biodiversity loss in the EU as well as on a global scale, and wants to restore ecosystems where possible. So these directives, in very short, but now let's have a closer look to what extent they have embedded ecosystem services. So let's start with the Water Framework Directive. This directive does not explicitly mention ecosystem services, but a subsequent guidance document wanted to promote ecosystem services or ecosystem service assessments to support the implementation of the directive. And background were observed deficiencies in the implementation of the directive because it was, among others, not really clear what the benefit of a good ecological status is. And here it was hoped that the ecosystem service concept could help to promote this understanding of the benefits. The Maritime Spatial Planning Directive acknowledges the importance of marine ecosystems and their services if integrated into planning decisions, but it does not really require the consideration of ecosystem services. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive was the first to contain some framing around ecosystem services, and then the Invasive Alien Species Regulation was the first that promoted a definition of ecosystem services, as well as promoting the concept within implementation at local level. The Habitats Directive does not mention ecosystem services, but it is a core element of implementing the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and this strategy does require the mapping and assessment of ecosystem services. So here you can already see that the different directives have implemented the ecosystem service concept to varying degrees. And this was then indeed also the conclusion in this study by Baumer et al., namely that the ecosystem service concept has only been incoherently established in EU policies, and that it was mainly environmental policies who have integrated ecosystem services to some extent. But those policies that have embedded the concept fully are only strategic in nature, and those are not legally binding. And one example is the EU Biodiversity Strategy, which I will now present in a bit more detail because it's quite important from an ecosystem service perspective and also for its development in Europe. So the EU Biodiversity Strategy had in total 6 targets, and in particular Action 5 under Target 2 was important because it aimed at improving the knowledge of ecosystems and their services in the EU. This Action 5 had several components. So it aimed for that member states assess, with the support of the Commission, the state of ecosystems and as well as the ecosystem services. The economic value of these services was supposed to be assessed, and the inclusion of these values into accounting and reporting systems and in national or at national and EU level was also aimed for. These last 2 points were addressed, among others, through the development of this common international classification of ecosystem services and short CISes. What do I mean by a classification? So it just simply says that the ecosystem services are divided into these provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. Another endeavor that was started by or as a response to this biodiversity strategy was then the mapping and assessment of ecosystems and their services. But how can you assess and map ecosystems or ecosystem services? On land, it's quite straightforward. So let's take a short excursion onto land. So there you have different land use and land cover maps. And then in a specific area, you know that you have these land covers, and then you can assess to what extent they can supply ecosystem services using model results by physical indicators or expert judgment. And then in this example here, the supply capacities are assessed on a scale from 0 to 5, so from no relevant supply to very high supply. And then because you have these different land cover maps, it's then also quite easy to map the provision of ecosystem services shown on these little maps here. And this relatively simple method to assess terrestrial ecosystem services is also reflected in the studies on terrestrial ecosystem services, which have increased considerably in the last 10-15 years. But marine ecosystem service research is still lagging behind. Why is that so? One of the main reasons is that there are just several challenges when it comes to mapping and assessing marine ecosystem services. So, for example, this CISes classification was developed for terrestrial services, and the transfer to marine areas is rather difficult because there we have less data on marine habitats. Furthermore, it's a 3-dimensional marine environment, and the services and the ecosystems they provide are spatially and highly and temporally very dynamic. So there's certainly a need for approaches specifically to assess marine ecosystem services, as well as a spatial typology on which you can base these assessments. So similar to this land cover typology that you have on land, but just a similar one for the marine areas. And there are some approaches for these, but before I go on to showing examples, let's briefly look again at all the different marine ecosystem services that we have. So we have the provisioning services, which can provide us with nutrition, for example, through wild and cultivated seafood, but also we have surface water for drinking purposes, which may at first seem strange. I mean, who wants to drink salt water, right? but it can be desalinated and then it can be used for human consumption. Then there are also certain ecosystem components that can provide raw materials for further processing to produce pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and fertilizers, for example. And then we also have surface water for non-drinking purposes, for example, cooling water power plants. And then you can use also algae, for example, to produce biofuels. Then we have the regulating and maintenance services, which include, for example, the reduction of excess nutrients by different macrophytes, the control of erosion rates, also, for example, by seagrass meadows, the protection of shorelines by coral reefs and mangroves, for example, and the provision of nursery habitats. So there are certain habitats that can or are very important for raising fish species. And then, of course, the oceans are also an important regulator of the global climate. Cultural services include, for example, recreation and leisure. And you can also, the oceans are also important for cognitive development through science and education. It offers areas of cultural heritage as well as inspiration. Some people may experience some spiritual experience at the seas. And for many, the oceans also have an intrinsic and bequest value, meaning that they want or wish to preserve marine ecosystems for future generations. So this is just a brief overview of the different marine ecosystem services and now how can you assess them. Here I would like to introduce you to this marine ecosystem service assessment tool, which is a spread-based tool which includes 10 provisioning, 11 regulating, and 10 cultural services. And it uses spatial definitions, reference conditions, and the good ecological status of the Water Framework Directive, and was also developed to support the implementation of this directive. It furthermore uses CISES, so this International Classification of Ecosystem Services, which divides ecosystem services into a hierarchy, which you can see here with the different divisions, groups, and classes. And then it allows you to make a relative ecosystem service assessment. What does it mean? So it just means that you assess the change of your ecosystem service over time. And then you assess whether the provision has increased, so color-coded in green here, if it has been, or if it has decreased, color-coded in red, or if there has been no change. But why would you want to do it? Let's say you know that the ecological status of your water body was much better, say 50 years ago, then you would expect that the provision of ecosystem services has also decreased over this time span. Alternatively, you could also develop different scenarios. So, for example, one where you have achieved a good ecological status in the future, and then you can show to what extent also your ecosystem services have or would increase in the future. And this just gives you additional justification for measures to improve the ecological status of your water body. What do I mean actually by water body? So the Water Framework Directive differentiates between different water bodies. One example is Greifswald Bay, so a lagoon in the eastern part of the German Baltic Sea. And the assessment for this water body you can see in this circle here. So you have the results for the regulating, provisioning, and cultural services. In green, meaning that there was an increase in ecosystem services, red that there was a decrease, and blue that there was no change. And on this map here, you can see the results for the for the regulating services. And as you can see, there has been no change of ecosystem service provision from the past to today. And this example just shows that these ecosystem service assessments are possible for a spatially defined area, in this case the water bodies, but in some cases you may want to have also more details, so a more differentiated spatial sea typology. So the Water Framework Directive uses these water bodies, which can be single lagoons and estuaries, such as Greifswald Bay, and then divides them further or according to physico-chemical parameters. And this just allows you to compare assessment and also make spatial extrapolations, because if you know or make an assessment for a water body in a specific, or that has specific physico-chemical parameters, and then you can compare it or extrapolate it to water bodies that have similar parameters. Here you can just see an example of how this spatial sea typology was applied in the Baltic Sea. So it is divided into inner coastal waters that are almost fresh water, then brackish inner coastal waters, brackish open coastal waters, and also brackish coastal waters that are seasonally stratified and may experience oxygen deficiency. And then in blue you have the coastal sea. And yes, as I said, this typology then allows you to make spatial extrapolation. But again, in some cases you may want to have even more details. And here again an example from Greifswald Bay, where this typology was then used to further specified according to habitat types. So here in this example, the inner coastal waters are further divided into areas where there are sand, gravel, and mud and sandbanks on the one hand, and on the other hand have areas with non-vegetated clay and mud. And the open coastal waters, so just outside of Greifswald Bay, are also further divided into non-vegetated sand, gravel, and sandbanks and reefs. And now this spatial typology allows you to assess the potential of ecosystem types to provide services. And then it can also be used as a basis to assess impacts of marine uses on these ecosystems, and hence then also assess what the implication is for the provision of ecosystem services in these areas. Now the examples that I just shown you are mostly case study based, or with the example of the typology for the German Baltic Sea, it's only a regional application. But there are also now endeavors to assess and map ecosystem services at the Baltic Sea scale. So one of these sea basin approaches for the Baltic Sea was developed by one working group of HELCOM, so the Baltic Marine Protection Commission, and it uses 42 different ecosystem components, which can be divided into these different benthic landscapes, the marine mammals and seabirds, distribution maps, and they have also selected a range of different regulating and cultural services. And as you can see, they have not selected provisioning services, and then they assessed on a binary scale to what extent or whether or not a certain ecosystem component can provide a certain marine ecosystem. And then this allows you to map these areas with low and high supply for the entire Baltic Sea. But because they only use the binary scale, so just saying yes, an ecosystem component can provide an ecosystem, yes or no, this link between the components and the ecosystem services need to be further refined and improved. To summarize the status of marine ecosystem service assessments, we can note that the concept has been developed on land and that the transfer to the marine area was rather difficult or still poses a challenge. which also resulted in that the mapping and assessment of marine ecosystem services is much less advanced than on land, because with the oceans, or in the oceans, we are dealing with a three-dimensional, highly dynamic, and data-scarce environment. There are some approaches, such as the Marine Ecosystem Service Assessment tool, which allows you to make a relative ecosystem service assessment over time. I've also shown you this spatial sea typology, which allows you to assess and map the capacity of ecosystems to provide services. And we have seen that in the Baltic Sea, there are approaches at case study level, but also at sea basin scale. When it comes to integrating ecosystem services into EU policy, we can know that there are certain strengths and weaknesses which have been summarized by Czarnecki and Robbe in this SWOT analysis. Here I will just focus or highlight some of them. So the ecosystem service concept can clearly show the link between human and nature. It provides a holistic approach, which is important from a policy perspective, because at least nowadays they want to have these holistic approaches. So there are certainly opportunities for using the concept in policy implementation and for supporting a better understanding of these human-nature interactions. However, there are also weaknesses. So these human-nature interactions are very often oversimplified in the ecosystem service concept. What is more, it focuses on an anthropocentric, instrumental view on nature, for which it has very often been criticized. And both of which may also lead, for example, to a resistance to use the results of such assessments, and on the long term may also lead to a loss of interest from policy. So what have we learned today in this lecture? We can know that ecosystem services are increasingly considered in EU policies, especially in environmental policies, but ecosystem services are only fully embedded into strategic policies such as the Biodiversity Strategy, which are not legally binding. And while there are certainly benefits for policy implementation, the approach also has methodological weaknesses. And so we can conclude that, yes, the ecosystem service concept is met with high expectations from policymakers. However, the current use for policy implementation is still limited and needs to be further proven. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.